Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement and Intelligence, and Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the state of U.S. law enforcement and how the Department of Homeland Security is engaged with state and local authorities across America to fight crime as well as prepare for disaster response. Without objection, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Michelle Steele, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Clay Higgins, and the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Laurel Lee, are permitted to sit on the dais and ask questions of the witnesses. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. We are holding an important hearing during National Police Week, a time when we recognize and honor the sacrifices and service of our men and women in law enforcement from across the country. I'm pleased to have some of my own constituents here that are joining us today, and I'd first like to recognize Odessa Police Chief Michael Gerke as a witness today. In addition, I'm pleased to have Midland County Sheriff David Kreiner and his wife Judy in the audience with us. I've had the luxury of getting to know both of these gentlemen as well over the last 2 years, and I know that Chief Gerke will provide some valuable insight as to what issues rural police departments are facing throughout the country. Unfortunately, I think we've forgotten what it means to support our men and women in law enforcement who serve our communities every day, many of whom, well, let me strike that, all of whom are real-life heroes. Last year, 246 law enforcement officers were tragically killed in the line of duty. This year, there have already been 41 officers killed in the line of duty serving their communities. Just this past Thursday, on May 11th, Sergeant Joshua Klaus of the Cameron Police Department in Texas was shot and killed by a subject who was wanted for shooting his wife during a domestic violence incident earlier in the night, as he and other officers executed a search warrant. Sergeant Klaus was an Army veteran and had a wife and 2 children. He is a hero, and I pray for his family and friends. We've also forgotten the importance of holding people accountable for engaging in criminal activities and preying on law-abiding citizens. From increases in aggravated assaults, robberies, and retail theft to dealing illicit fentanyl, I think many Americans no longer feel safe in their communities. Some cities are even releasing criminals back into their communities due to zero bail policies and downgrading the sentencing for felonies, allowing these bad actors to continue committing crimes. What message is this sending to career criminals? It is not one of law and order, but instead encourages lawlessness across the homeland. It is unacceptable. While criminals are not being held accountable for their actions, our law enforcement officers face extremely low morale in many places. And unfortunately, in some places, that's due to anti-police sentiment. Extreme budget cuts, rogue legal reforms, and the media bias against law enforcement have resulted in significant recruitment and retention challenges for state and local law enforcement agencies across the country. These factors are not only preventing law enforcement from carrying out their duties to protect Americans, but they're also impeding police agencies across the homeland from having the resources to further train officers and prevent other mishaps. If we continue down the path of cutting law enforcement budgets, police departments will be left with a difficult choice between lowering recruitment standards or being unable to meet their hiring needs. This committee has an important role to play as we oversee the Department of Homeland Security, which looks to support, and let me say that again, support state and local, tribal, territorial law enforcement agencies in their efforts to keep our communities safe, secure, and resilient. From a Homeland Security standpoint, it has been over 20 years since 9/11 happened, yet we still have challenges for the timely sharing of information and between the federal government and state and local agencies. While we have made significant progress, I worry that there continue to be gaps in how we share information in a consistent and timely manner. We have to work together to overcome these barriers, as information sharing is critical to combat the wide variety of threats that we face today. In particular, when it comes to fusion centers, which are primarily state-funded facilities established with the purpose of information sharing between those levels, there's a common saying that says, if you've seen one fusion center, you've seen one fusion center. It's important that we ensure DHS is properly supporting fusion centers as they serve as focal points in state and urban areas for the receipt, analysis, gathering, and sharing of threat-related information. States like Texas have many different threats impacting their communities. I've seen firsthand how Metropolitan areas like the one I visited in San Antonio can coordinate seamlessly between federal, state, and local levels. Furthermore, DHS provides various federal grants to assist state, local, and territorial partners. We need to ensure that these grant programs continue and that they are effective in doing out what their mission says that they should be doing. Unfortunately, rural areas like my district do not experience that luxury and must rely on fusion centers that are located in other areas. And there have been numerous times in the last month where Texas, DPS, or CBP were pursuing human smugglers, drug traffickers, or other malign actors through small towns in West Texas along the border that have led to catastrophic loss of life. Had a fusion center been established that caters to the unique needs of those rural areas, maybe it could have been easier for local and state law enforcement agencies to better coordinate with CBP and DPS. Today, I hope that we can examine this issue. I hope that we can find ways to highlight the information sharing and where it can be more readily available and more effective. Lastly, it's important that our nation must restore a sense of appreciation for the men and women who wear the uniform, who protect our communities, and who have been willing to sacrifice their own lives for the betterment of their communities. We have a very distinguished panel of witnesses to testify about the challenges between state and local law enforcement agencies, both in rural and in urban areas. And I'd like to thank all of our witnesses, not just for being here today, but more importantly, for you and your family's sacrifices in being willing to serve our nation. I now recognize the ranking member on this committee, Mr. Magaziner, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, and particularly our law enforcement witnesses. Thank you for your selfless service. Every day, you and the men and women you serve alongside and put your lives at risk to protect and serve this nation. And while this is National Police Week, we honor your service every day. We are grateful for the sacrifices you and your families make, and we particularly honor those officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice and have died in the line of duty. I know I speak for everyone on both of our committees when I express my gratitude to you and our commitment to supporting the funding, the staffing, and the technology that you need to do your jobs safely and effectively. We also want to highlight the importance of strong relationships between law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve. Community policing models based upon respect and collaboration between law enforcement and civilians have consistently been shown to be effective in reducing crime and improving safety of both officers and civilians. Police officers are often the first responders on the scene of overdoses, and we must ensure that officers have the support and the training to respond effectively in the midst of this epidemic. And in order for us to reduce crime and make police work safer for those who put on the uniform, we must continue to fight for common sense gun safety laws so that neighborhoods are safe from gun violence and police officers are never outgunned. In the last several years, 504 police officers were killed on duty in the United States, and of those, 456 officers were fatally shot with a gun, meaning that 90% of line-of-duty deaths were perpetrated with a gun. This gun violence epidemic has only become worse in recent years. From 2020 to 2021, the number of police officers fatally shot rose 35%, and it should be no surprise that these increasing occurrences of preventable officer deaths are 3 times more likely to occur in states with weak gun laws. States like mine that have passed common sense gun safety laws like background checks, red flag laws, and ghost gun and high capacity magazine bans generally see lower levels of gun violence and officers killed on duty than states with weaker gun safety laws. Another factor in preventing violence is strong collaboration and information sharing between federal and local law enforcement agencies. I share the chairman's concern and our focus on this area because it is particularly important in preventing acts of terrorism, which is a key focus of our subcommittee. We must build on the lessons learned from the Fusion Center model and ensure that collaboration between state and local law enforcement in anticipating and neutralizing threats, both foreign and domestic, is as seamless as possible. Information sharing between federal and local agencies is vital in neutralizing terror threats and preventing mass casualty events. I find it disturbing that some of our colleagues have taken to calling for federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI and the ATF to be defunded. I know that they do not speak for all in their party, and they certainly do not speak for all Americans, but this rhetoric is dangerous for many reasons, including the fact that these agencies play a vital role in supporting local law enforcement in preventing and responding to mass casualty events. My hope is that this hearing will provide insight to us as legislators on the best practices from around the country as we work together in our shared goal to improve the safety of our homeland and all of its citizens. In addition to having an earnest conversation about gun safety laws and fusion centers, I hope to hear from today's witnesses about ways that the federal government can support your efforts to keep communities safe, including through improved information sharing. I want to thank the chairman for calling this hearing, and I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record two statements from the Brady United Against Gun Violence and Gifford Law Center detailing how weak gun laws endanger law enforcement. I also ask for unanimous consent that Congresswoman Jackson Lee and Congressman Ivey be allowed to sit in on today's hearing and question the witnesses, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and so ordered on the request. I'd now like to recognize the chairman for the Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology, the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito. Before he speaks, know that he is also a former detective for the New York Police Department and has also spent time being willing to sacrifice his own life for the betterment of his community. Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I want to first, on this Police Week, I want to thank you for your service and your commitment to keeping this nation and our community safe. I want to thank Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and Ranking Member Carter for joining me to convene this hearing today where we will examine the critically important topic of the state of crime in the United States of America and the federal government's role in supporting state and local law enforcement efforts throughout the country. As we mentioned, it is Police Week, and I do want to thank our nation's police officers for putting their lives on the line each and every day to protect our neighborhoods and keep our families safe. As a retired New York City Police Department detective, I know firsthand how challenging a career in law enforcement can be. Regardless of the risk, police officers show up every day to put the needs of their communities first. They truly stand the line between good and evil. To our police officers and law enforcement serving throughout the nation, thank you for your bravery and for your service. We commend all of you for your unwavering commitment to keeping us all safe. To those who we've honored over the last few days in the line of duty, we honor you. When we all take an oath to protect and serve, we also make a promise in our hearts to never forget. And I promise that I will do everything in my power to make sure that we never forget them. As we will hear in your testimonies, the challenges facing our law enforcement community are increasingly complex and every day seem to evolve. Americans can't turn on the news without hearing stories of carjackings, robberies, increased acts of senseless violence across this country, not to mention the continued threat of terrorism. The sad fact is, many Americans no longer feel safe in their communities. As members of the Homeland Security Committee, we must ensure that our nation's law enforcement personnel have the resources and necessary tools to keep our communities safe and protect this great homeland. That is why we are dedicating this time to evaluate how the federal government can continue to support our state and local agencies. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, suite of preparedness grants assist state, local, tribal, and territorial governments to prepare for, protect against, respond to, and recover from terrorist attacks, major disasters, and other emergencies. From lessons learned after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, these grant programs provide local law enforcement with the vital training and equipment they need to prepare for new challenges as they arise in our communities. In fact, over the last 10 years, the New York City urban area has received over $2 billion in grant funding to prevent, prepare for, and protect against terrorist attacks in New York City. My home state has benefited immensely from the Urban Area Security Initiative, the State Homeland Security Grant Program, and the Transportation Security Grant Program, to only name a few. For example, federal grant funding supports the Counterterrorism Officer Program that provides NYPD patrol officers with specialized counterterrorism training to enable officers to conduct counterterrorism operations at specific intelligence-driven locations throughout the city. Grant funds have been used to purchase concrete barriers to save pedestrians and cyclists from vehicular terrorism, a necessary tool following the 2017 vehicle ramming in Lower Manhattan. And grant funds have supported the Vapor Wake Detection Canine Program, which trains canines to trail explosive or chemical odors. With New York remaining a top terror target, the importance of grant funding, not only in New York City, but throughout this country, is paramount. As the chairman of the Emergency Management and Technology Subcommittee, I will continue to advocate for robust investment in these security grant programs. However, when examining these grant programs, it is also important to ensure that smaller or more rural enforcement agencies across the country have the resources that they need to adapt to the changing threat landscape in their respective states. In the past decade, the threats against our homeland have changed. Domestic and small-scale acts of terrorism now threaten our communities, and hate-filled attacks have become more frequent. According to a recent FBI report, hate crime incidents increased by 11.6% in 21, from 8,210 incidents in 2020 to over 9,000 in 2021. More than half of all religious hate crimes were motivated by anti-Semitism, further highlighting the importance of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which provides our faith-based communities with the means to harden their defenses, acquire security equipment, and provide training to better safeguard their congregants. The rise in crime across the country points to the importance of FEMA's preparedness grant programs and the need for strengthening local law enforcement efforts, many departments like you represent. Today, the national homicide rate is 34% higher than it was in 2019. Major crimes in New York rose by 22% in 2022. Burglaries and robberies increased by 37%. However, instead of supporting law enforcement, we've heard calls for slashing police budgets and defunding police, which have promoted soft-on-crime policies that allow repeat offenders to roam the streets. At a time when crime is increasing, we should be strengthening law enforcement, not making our communities more vulnerable. I want to take a minute to focus on New York, where Democrats impose cashless bail and criminal justice reform. And as someone who has lived and seen the criminal justice system at work, I understand all well that reforms do need to be made. But those reforms can't be done with a broad brush. They also can't be done without having conversations with people from law enforcement. And we've seen that now, in places like New York, criminals are free to roam the streets and once again commit more crimes after committing their first. We want to talk about gun violence. We should focus on gun violence and removing illegal guns off the street first. That's where our focus should be. Our focus should be on providing law enforcement with the resources that they need to take illegal firearms off the street. It is interesting when we hear individuals talk about gun violence and talk about different weapons used, not a weapon, or know the difference between weapons, but they do know that it looks, quote, scary. Well, what is scary is being in the middle of a street in some of the most violent neighborhoods in the communities that you represent or the ones that I used to patrol, and actually wrestling an illegal gun off the street with your life in your hands. So instead of focusing on where we're failing, we should focus and make sure that rogue DAs throughout this country who like to rewrite laws are actually putting bad people behind bars. Every day, our nation's police officers are on the front lines, responding to threats against our homeland. They're our heroes, and right now they need our support. Whether they serve in big cities like Los Angeles, or where I came from in the NYPD, or in smaller towns like Island Park, where I grew up, or Nassau County, or where you represent, we owe law enforcement community a huge debt of gratitude. I also want to talk about accountability, because it's a two-way street, and we must hold our police departments to a higher standard. Small and mid-sized departments need to be targeted investments to address ongoing challenges with recruitment, retention, and PTSD. We must ensure that police departments across this country, no matter how large or how small, are working effectively to serve the people, and it is our job to make sure that they have the resources they need to do that. I want to thank you for upholding the rule of law, and thank you for putting yourselves in harm's way to protect our freedom. I've mentioned it throughout this week that Police Week always makes me reflect back on the inscription at the memorial. Right under the line, it says, "It is not how these individuals died that made them heroes, it's how they lived." So let's make sure that we can do all we can to give the resources to the men and women that live every day protecting and serving. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to learn how we can strengthen local law enforcement efforts. Now more than ever, we must work together to protect our homeland. I think you'd all agree with me that the thousands upon thousands of 911 calls we've responded to, there's never once been a question asked whether you are a Democrat or Republican. So let's work together, not as parties and politics, but as Americans to keep this great nation safe. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman D'Esposito. I now recognize the ranking member for the Subcommittee on Emergency Management and Technology, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, and to our guests, thank you for being here. We look forward to hearing your testimony. I want to take a moment to reflect on the tragic shootings in Allen, Texas. My condolences go out to the families of the victims. The video that circulated of this man jumping out of an SUV, wielding an AR-15, and wearing tactical vest as he mercilessly killed people until an officer who just happened to be at the mall took him out. It was harrowing. But the video is a visual testimony. It's testimony of the depravity of weak gun laws in our country. It's a testimony to the risk of our communities and our police officers face because Republicans refuse to pass meaningful gun violence prevention laws. Many of you know that I'm a gun owner and an avid hunter, but I'm a responsible gun owner who firmly believes in stronger gun laws, one who believes in the Second Amendment, but also recognizes that we can do better in making sure that we're protecting our communities without infringing upon one's constitutional right to bear arms. Weak gun laws are killing our children. They're killing our parents, our grandparents. These are not black or white, Republican or Democrat, rich or poor. They're Americans. They're people. They're human beings. They deserve better. And we, as a committee and as a Congress, have a responsibility to do better. And as my colleague said moments ago, it's not Republican or Democrat. And we should be able to come together. But heretofore, we have not. And we've got to do better. And I'm hopeful through the testimony today that we're able to keep it in focus of why we're here and what our true task is. Not to over-politicize, not to self-aggrandize, not to create theater, but to create policy that will save lives. I'm glad that we're holding this hearing and protecting the homeland and supporting law enforcement. Because we want to talk about protecting the homeland and supporting law enforcement, we talk about weapons of war that are on our streets and making our homeland less safe and putting law enforcement in the line of fire. Over the years, we've seen dramatic increases in gun violence against civilians and law enforcement. My district has struggled with gun violence in New Orleans, accounting for nearly 5% of all mass shootings across the country this year, far outpacing any other city in the country. Gun violence isn't isolated to one space. We've seen gun violence in our schools, malls, houses of worship, and public areas. Our country has a problem. We need strong common sense gun laws in every state, not only to protect children, but also to protect you, our law enforcement. Officers often find themselves in dangerous situations while performing their duties. In states with weak gun regulations, the dangers officers face is substantially greater to the Giffords Law Center, which grades states based on the strength of their gun laws. States that receive an F in their gun laws saw higher rates of police fatalities from 2017 to 2021. These are real statistics. These are real numbers. These are real lives. These are real people. The virtually unregulated guns circulating in our communities are threats to Homeland Security and to law enforcement lives. The data is clear. In 2021, almost 73% of law enforcement officers who died from felonious assaults were killed by firearms. These firearms have only risen in recent years, making guns one of the leading causes of death in the line of duty for law enforcement in America. We must do more to protect our homeland, our communities, and our officers. That means we need to work across the aisle to pass common sense gun laws and continue to work together to strengthen and fund the Department of Homeland Security's grant programs, which are critical to protecting our communities and law enforcement personnel from these threats. Programs like the Urban Area Security Initiative, UASI, and the United States Security Grant Program, SHSP, assist in assuring that local law enforcement have the resources they need to defend our communities against threats. The Nonprofit Security Grant Program provides nonprofits with funding to help with their security, which is critical given the surge in right-wing violence against nonprofits, including religious organizations. While we work to address gun violence, we must continue to do our part to provide the Department of Homeland Security with funding for its grants programs to ensure that nonprofits and law enforcement have the resources they need to protect our communities. And to our witnesses, thank you for being here today. The law enforcement witnesses, I want to thank you and all those who stand beside you for your service. We appreciate your being here today during National Police Week. I look forward to hearing from you. I look forward to us having a meaningful exchange, one that I hope can stay within the boundaries and stay within the lines. And I compel my colleagues likewise that we make this a clear opportunity to make a difference and not to make a statement for the press. That we use this as an opportunity to find resolve and solutions, not to further divide a country that is sickened with the bloodshed that we see in our communities. Each day, it gets a little closer. I hope and pray that we collectively can find a way to have resolutions that don't have R's or D's behind them, but have American lives that are being saved. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member, and I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the witnesses being here at today's hearing on protecting the homeland, an examination of federal efforts to support state and local law enforcement. Before I begin, I want to condemn the hateful violence we saw yesterday when two congressional staffers, one of them an intern on her first day at work, were beaten with a baseball bat while at work in Virginia for Congressman Jerry Connolly. I pray for their recovery quickly. Protecting the homeland ultimately means protecting the people who live here, which is what the brave men and women who serve in law enforcement do every day. We thank them for their service as we commemorate National Police Week. I welcome today's discussion about how the federal government can support state and local law enforcement in their efforts to protect our communities. Tragically, in the days and weeks leading up to this hearing, there have been a series of mass killings inspired by those who hold extremist views. My heart goes out to the victims and families of those murdered in an apparent right-wing extremist shooting in Allen, Texas. My heart also goes out to the victims and families of those killed after a driver rammed his SUV into people waiting outside near a shelter in Brownsville, Texas, after he reportedly shouted anti-immigrant rhetoric. When we talk about protecting the homeland and supporting state and local law enforcement, we must acknowledge that extremist views coupled with weak gun laws is driving violence across the United States. Moreover, weak gun laws are making our law enforcement officers less safe. The United States is facing a crisis of epic proportion when it comes to gun violence. Children are not safe at school. Shoppers are not safe at stores. Worshippers are not safe at church. Journalists are not safe in the newsroom. Gun massacres are happening more often, and they are deadlier than ever. If we want to protect the homeland and support law enforcement, we must reform the laws that let dangerous people obtain weapons and turn them on our communities and those who are sworn to serve and protect. And when we talk about protecting the homeland, we must acknowledge the very real threat from heavily weaponized domestic terrorists, including white supremacists and anti-government extremists have. As FBI Director Christopher Wray has said, domestic terrorism, particularly white supremacist extremism, is the most persistent and lethal threat to this country. It's unfortunate that my colleagues across the aisle refuse to include domestic terrorism as a part of this committee's oversight plan, as we cannot properly examine how to protect the homeland and support law enforcement without acknowledging the most persistent terrorism threat we face as a country. It is my hope that, moving forward, the members of this committee can find common ground on combating violence and protecting the homeland. When it comes to protecting our communities from violence, the Department of Homeland Security's grant programs are key. For example, the Urban Area Security Initiative, commonly called UASI, and State Homeland Security Grant help ensure that local law enforcement have the training and equipment they need to protect against terrorist threat. As the chairman from New York so eloquently put, that $2 billion that New York has gotten from UASI is a Homeland Security grant. It's a wonderful program. I wish we had more money. The department struggles because we can only do so many cities across the country, and those who fall off the list are the ones who come and complain that we need the money to do. So I'm sure some of our colleagues will hear from those communities with the next round of eligible communities. The Nonprofit Security Grant Program provides nonprofit organizations at high risk of a terrorist attack with funding to help bolster their security, which is especially important given the rise of right-wing extremist attack against nonprofits such as faith-based communities. Even though Congress has increased funding for the program, there is a growing need for organizations to access the funding. The Nonprofit Security Grant Program Improvement Act, which I authored, make improvements to the program and will provide support to nonprofits with particular attention to nonprofits in underserved communities. As we work to ensure the law enforcement has the resources to protect our communities, we must remain steadfast and provide DHS with full and robust funding for the critical grants program. I hope to hear from our witnesses on how we can better support our law enforcement and public safety by passing common sense gun reform, combating domestic terrorism, and supporting DHS grant funding, including UASI and Nonprofit Security Grant Program. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. And I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. I'd like to now formally introduce our witnesses. Michael Gerke serves as Chief of Police for the Odessa, Texas Police Department. In this role, he serves as the Chief Administrator of the Odessa Police Department and is responsible for the policy development, control, supervision, and program implementation of this department and is accountable for the effective delivery of police service to the community. The Chief's office is the command center of the department and administrates the department's annual budget. Chief Gerke has proudly served Odessa, Texas, and that department for more than 26 years. He received an associate degree in criminal justice and police science from Odessa College, a bachelor of applied arts and science and criminal justice in law enforcement from Midwestern State University, and a master of science from Tarleton State University. I'd like to now and Chief, thank you for being here. I'd like to now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Michelle Steele, to introduce Sheriff Dawn Barnes.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today, and it is my honor to introduce Sheriff Dawn Barnes of Orange County, California. With over 30 years of service, Sheriff Barnes is well-versed in the public safety needs of Orange County residents. Sheriff Barnes leads the 4,000 sworn and professional men and women who provides a variety of vital public safety service to our community, our residents, over 3.2 million people. Involvement in both state and national law enforcement organizations that advocate common sense public safety policy is a priority for Sheriff Barnes. When I was the chair of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, Sheriff Barnes and I worked closely to respond to emergencies like COVID-19, civil unrest, and wildfires. We also fought back together against California's sanctuary state policies that would have prohibited the county from working with ICE to apprehend dangerous criminals. It's not just a serious work only, but we had fun too. I wanted to show my appreciation to the Sheriff's Department and Sheriff. I brought the In-N-Out truck, so we shared the burger together during the lunch. So it's not just a serious work relationship, but we are building our relationship together, and I really love Sheriff Barnes. I'm proud to be here with Sheriff Barnes and look forward to our continued work together to keep the people of Orange County safe. The sheriff also serves as an executive officer with the California State Sheriff's Association and serves as the chair of California State Sheriff's Association's Technology Committee. At the national level, he is chair of Major County Sheriffs of America Intelligence Commander Committee. Sheriff Barnes strongly believes that members of law enforcement must be engaged with the community they serve, and he's everywhere in Orange County. He serves as the board chairman for Orange County Crime Stoppers. Because of our sheriff in Orange County, his men and women, Orange County is one of the safe cities in the United States, especially California, that our crime rates are very high. I can truly say from my personal experience that he's one of the most exceptional law enforcement officers in the country. I think he's the best, and we are fortunate to have him before this committee, and I really want to thank him for being here, and it's very nice to see him in Washington, D.C., not just in Orange County. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady from California for that very nice introduction, and I now recognize the ranking member from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, to introduce Commissioner Cox.
Thank you, Chairman. While there are parts of the country where crime has increased in recent years, it is also important to note that there are parts of the country that have bucked that trend. And for example, in my home city of Providence in 2022, we had our lowest number of homicides in 50 years last year. And right up the road from us in Boston, the city of Boston has had stable record levels of violent crime in recent years that are near historic lows. So in order to share the lessons learned and the best practices from the historically low rates of violent crime in Boston in recent years, I'm pleased to introduce Commissioner Michael Cox of the Boston Police Department, a department of which he is a 30-year veteran. Prior to his appointment as commissioner in the Boston Police Department, Commissioner Cox served as a bureau chief and a sergeant detective in the intelligence unit, where he performed dignitary protection duties, served as a liaison to the U.S. Secret Service, and as a supervisor assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Commissioner Cox also served as chief of police for the Ann Arbor Police Department in Ann Arbor, Michigan, from 2019 to 2022. Welcome, Commissioner Cox, and thank you.
I thank the ranking member. I'd now like to introduce our final witness on the panel. Mr. Rafael Mangual is a fellow and head of research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal and a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. Mr. Mangual's work has been featured and mentioned in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Atlanta, the New York Post, and other outlets. In 2020, he was appointed to serve a 4-year term as a member of the New York State Advisory Committee on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Mr. Mangual has also testified multiple times before Congress on policing topics. He holds degrees from City University of New York and DePaul University in Chicago, including a law degree. Thank you for being here, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here. And now for the part that we actually came for, the witness testimony. And I'd ask each of you, you've submitted your written testimony, so please summarize and do try to stay within 5 minutes, because we do have lots of members who want to ask you questions. I now recognize from Odessa, Texas, Chief Michael Gerke for your opening statement.
Well, good morning, distinguished members of the committee. The reason for the existence of law enforcement agencies is to make the lives of the citizens that they serve better. And it's my belief that the main way that we do that is to reduce violent crime. Violent crime has the most significant effect on their victims. To this end, as an example of effective policing, about 2.5 years ago, we partnered with the United States Attorney's Office in the Western District of Texas for the priority prosecution of those individuals apprehended in our community who were convicted felons, narcotic dealers, and gang members who were in possession of firearms. This led not only to a reduction of violent crime in the area, but also a reduction in property crimes such as auto thefts and burglaries. This is a shining example of what partnerships between local and federal authorities can accomplish. We continue to have a very strong relationship with the Assistant United States Attorney in our area, and she is one of the most trusted and valued members of our team. It's very important to have these relationships as we move into the future and face the coming challenges. The most persistent challenge that we feel at this point in my community is the use and abuse of fentanyl. The use of fentanyl has led to numerous overdoses and numerous deaths in our community. And we all know that trade route for fentanyl starts in China, comes through Mexico, and crosses the border and ends up in our community. And it's, particularly in West Texas, it's harming predominantly our children, our young adults. We've seen 12-year-olds to 19-year-olds to 60-year-olds who have overdosed on fentanyl. We're at the point in law enforcement that we have issued Narcan or other types of antidotes to every one of our officers, not just to help to relieve the overdoses with the victims, but also to help each other. Because unfortunately, officers do come in contact with fentanyl when we find it illegally on the street, unknowingly get contaminated, and we have to apply those antidotes to each other. But I also want to talk about another challenge that we face, and that challenge is staffing levels, pure and simple. Odessa, as you look across this panel, I am the small guy on the panel. So I have 181 sworn positions. Of those 181 positions, I'm about 38 short as we speak today. And I live in Odessa, which is the Permian Basin, which is one of the world's leading oil and gas producing areas, right? So high school graduates often don't see the value of education. They don't see the value of waiting. And they move into employment in the petroleum industry. And quite honestly, those careers pay more than a career in law enforcement. You can take an 18-year-old young man that graduates from Permian High School, and that young man in a matter of a few months can be making 6 figures in the oil field. Our starting salary is $69,000. Also, in Texas, individuals cannot be employed as police officers until they're 21 years of age. Many times that 3-year gap leads individuals to different career paths and down paths that no longer allow them to be in law enforcement. Going back to violent crime and fighting that and other issues such as narcotics in our community, I want to take a moment to just talk about the importance of technology. Because when you look at smaller departments like mine, sometimes the funding's not there, but there's grants. But sometimes those smaller departments, even smaller than mine, have a very small knowledge of those grants. So I think there needs to be a push, a help for those smaller departments to understand those grants. Because I tell you, automatic license plate readers and video cameras and advanced analytical software and forensic equipment are game changers. They're absolute game changers. And finally, I'd just like to say it's essential that more and better cooperation between all levels of law enforcement happen and that proper outcomes be identified. Please understand, numbers of arrests and the numbers of seizures don't really matter as much as lowering the number of crime victims. So what we should be worried about is our victims. We can only accomplish these reductions if we all work together. Remember, and this is what we say around the office all the time, egos and attitudes are the enemy of progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Gerke. I now recognize Sheriff Barnes for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger and D'Esposito, and I want to also thank Ranking Members Magaziner, Carter, and Thompson for allowing us to provide a local perspective on policing in America. My testimony will focus on the challenges, some of which are the result of misguided policies, and I will share some what I believe solutions to these issues. Before discussing broad threats, it is important for the committee to know the environment law enforcement faces as a result of policies that have boosted criminal activity and made our jobs much more difficult. Over the last decade, California has incrementally enacted laws reducing penalties for crime while also removing tools from law enforcement. The results of the decriminalization efforts are clear. Since 2011, we've seen an almost 32% increase in homicides in the state. Aggravated assaults have increased by almost 35%. Drug-related deaths have more than doubled from 4,118 to 10,898 in a 10-year period, and the years following that have gone up substantially more. The National Retail Federation reported an estimated $94.5 billion in losses to retail theft nationwide in 2021, with the largest losses occurring in the state of California, metropolitan areas. This number, for comparison, was $44 billion in 2014. As we address the policy-created lawlessness, we deal with the local impacts of external threats facing our country. The border crisis, the rapidly emerging cyber threat, and an ongoing wave of foreign malign influence, a fentanyl crisis of epic proportions, and the proliferation of active shooting incidents across our country. Regarding the border, most relevant to this committee is a lack of an effective strategy to secure our southern border. One thing this has meant for my community is an influx of fentanyl. In 2021, just the Orange County Sheriff's Department investigation seized 132 pounds of fentanyl and 16,000 clandestine produced fentanyl pills. 1 year later, this increased to 450 pounds of pure fentanyl and over 400,000 clandestine produced fentanyl pills. What we're seeing at the border today in the wake of Title 42 ending will manifest into security challenges for local communities. The challenges faced by the men and women of law enforcement are daunting, but there is hope. There are solutions. Today, I will highlight one of those solutions, our Fusion Center in Orange County, the Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center, known as the OCIAC, created in 2007, has evolved into addressing all crimes and all hazards, not just counterterrorism. Recognizing the fact that sharing information is key to addressing challenges of the day, we have integrated OCIAC into facing many facets of our operations. To meet the increased cyber threat, OCIAC developed a cyber liaison officer program. To date, over 700 personnel have been trained. We participate in active shooter and school safety, over 300 assessments done in just the last calendar school year. We created a House of Worship training. In 2016, launched the Faith Liaison program, and more than 500 houses of worship have partnered in this program and training. We participate in human trafficking. Last year during the Super Bowl, the OCIAC led one of the nation's most successful human trafficking operations, known as Operation Red Zone, partnering with 11 local agencies, resulting in the arrest of 56 suspects and 16 victims being recovered, including 2 juveniles as part of that operation. Finally, I'd like to highlight a few ways the federal government can better support local law enforcement. The security at the border is paramount. Congress must pass legislation to secure our border once and for all. Major county sheriffs of America documented this in a border security priorities and has been included in my written testimony. I want to recognize and appreciate the fact that this committee's recently passed Border Reinforcement Act incorporates several of those priorities. Sustained investment in personnel and resources for our fusion centers are paramount. Increased Homeland Security grant funding and embedded personnel in our fusion centers will strengthen our operations. More interagency communication among partners would assist in addressing the cyber threat and local tools to address technologies like unmanned aircraft. California's example should be a warning for others. Minimizing the consequences for law breaking results in a breakdown of society. Congress must be watchful of the destabilizing impacts of policies that empower criminals and victimize law-abiding residents. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my perspective. I'm happy to help and answer any questions you may have of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff Barnes. I now recognize Commissioner Cox for his opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, Chairman D'Esposito, and Ranking Member Carter, and Ranking Member Thompson for the invitation to testify alongside my fellow law enforcement leaders. It's my honor to represent the men and women of the Boston Police Department and the City of Boston. I welcome the opportunity to be with you today and share the impact and partnerships with the federal government that we're having in Boston. The Boston Police has a long history of proactive community policing combined with strategic deployment and focused interventions based on analysis and crime data intelligence. A substantial portion of our capabilities are funded by our partnership with the federal government through grants that are critical to public safety in the Boston metro region. First and foremost, we are a strong proponent of community policing in our department. To keep our city safe, the police must build trust with residents in all the neighborhoods we serve through deliberate and consistent relationship building. These efforts are critical to preventing crime and terrorism. Indeed, community members will not report criminal or suspicious behavior if they don't trust the local police to act appropriately with the information. The Boston Police Department prioritizes partnering with stakeholders to address issues and solve problems. In addition, the BPD partners with mental health and social service programs to connect those at risk with services and support. Our department has strengthened our ongoing engagement efforts and started community ComStat meetings in each of our 11 police districts. The goal is to take a sense of empowerment and problem solving we get from the internal ComStat meetings and push it out into the community. Our intelligence-led policing model complements our community policing. It provides real-time intelligence and analysts to inform strategic decision-making and deployment of resources with a focus on individuals driving crime and violence. This model is paying dividends in Boston. Overall, serious crime, Part 1 crime, have been going in a downward trend, declining more than 50% since 2005, which correlates with the establishment of our Boston Regional Intelligence Center, better known as the BRIC, that same year. Year-to-date, Part 1 offenses has declined 6% compared to 2022 and 6% below a 5-year average. Annual shooting victim totals have fluctuated over the past 10 years. In 2018, 2019, and 2021, a number has been historically low. Then, like many other cities' total shooting victims reached a 10-year high in Boston in 2020. However, unlike other major cities, Boston saw a 28% decrease in 21, and in 2022, shooting victims total declined an additional 8% to the lowest level since the 1950s. Despite the decline in crimes, firearm violence continues to be a concern. Aftermarket enhancement like large capacity magazines and shear switches, as well as the emergence of privately manufactured firearms, better known as ghost guns, have exacerbated the issues. Last year, with the assistance from our federal partners, we investigated individuals manufacturing ghost guns and yielded firearm parts, 3D printers, and ammunition. The number of ghost guns recovered in 2022 increased 79% from 2021. Overall, there's a 24% increase in recovered crime guns between 2019 and 2022 in Boston. In 2022, approximately 10% of crime guns recovered were reported stolen. 33% of those were from Massachusetts. The rest were from elsewhere. Repeat offenders account for a large portion of our violence in our city. In 2022, 564 individuals were arrested on firearm charges. 42% had prior firearm arrests, with 102 of those arrested having 3 or more. The BRIC was established in 2005 to coordinate efforts with public safety participants in the Boston Urban Area Security Initiative, better known as your UIC grant. It was created to reduce criminal activity and prevent and respond to terrorism in all its forms. DHS and the intelligence analyst personnel are instrumental to intelligence sharing and risk mitigations. DHS cybersecurity expertise has provided effective support in investigating ransomware attacks and other financially motivated cyber crimes. I and many of our counterparts are concerned that level funding or decreasing grants is a potential here, and we are deeply concerned about that. Congress could assist law enforcement by increasing funding across Homeland Security grant program to include the UASC and consider broadening its applicability beyond terrorism to include threats traditionally mitigated by U.S. Department of Defense and intelligence community. Federal investments in grant programs are vital, as are the assignments of DHS and the personnel assigned to its fusion centers. Without these resources, cities and towns are vulnerable, and I encourage Congress to continue to invest in these programs. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Commissioner Cox. I now recognize Mr. Mangual for his opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Flager, Chairman D'Esposito, distinguished members of the committee. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to testify on a matter of great importance. The law enforcement community is facing many challenges, but 2 that stand out the most, particularly in and around major cities, are the challenges of responding to a real increase in crime at a time in which many agencies are struggling with officer recruitment and retention. In other words, in many parts of the country, police are being asked to shoulder a much bigger burden with respect to crime and disorder, and they're being asked to do so with fewer and/or less experienced officers. In 2019, the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, surveyed its member agencies on this issue. Only 12% reported not facing a shortage of full-time sworn personnel, while a plurality, 41% of respondents, reported that their shortages had increased over the prior 5 years. A 2021 follow-up survey reported a 5% decline in the hiring rate and an 18% increase in the resignation rate, as well as a 45% spike in the retirement rate relative to the prior year. The largest agencies in that set bore the brunt of these trends. In between these 2 years, the U.S. saw a 30% spike in homicides, the largest ever one-year increase in at least a century. And while a more recent PERF survey showed an increase in police hiring rates in 2022, the increase was outpaced by resignations and retirements, driving a continued overall decline in total staffing. Even if hiring kept up in departments, they would nevertheless have to contend with the decline in the median experience levels of their officers as retirees and resignees take their institutional and practical knowledge with them. Add to this mix the understandably heightened level of scrutiny police now face, as well as the often indefensible vitriol hurled at police as an institution, and you exacerbate all of the issues that flow from these challenges by sapping the morale of the officers that remain to face this all-important task. And this is not a recipe for success. Addressing these issues by helping to reinforce American police departments should be considered a top priority by Congress because it will reduce crime. but it may also help send a message to an embattled institution, one that says we're behind you, at a time in which cops need to hear that probably more than ever. Now, the body of evidence that can be marshaled in support of a large-scale effort to add to the ranks of America's police departments is overwhelmingly strong and robust. Indeed, one of the most consistent findings in the criminological literature is that more police means less crime, and vice versa. Moreover, the police recruitment and retention crises are ones that the federal government is actually well positioned to address by funding the hiring of new recruits, as well as funding incentive programs aimed at retaining senior officers and investigators. Now, because the impact of such expenditures will turn on how well police perform, which in turn depends in significant part on how well they understand the problems that they face in their respective jurisdictions, the need for more and better data on crime and enforcement trends is particularly pronounced, especially in light of the very poor transition from the Uniform Crime Reports to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And this need for data to inform how police can put their limited resources to their highest end uses highlights other opportunities for meaningful federal interventions aimed at funding and incentivizing more granular data collection. Now, congressional efforts to boost police hiring, to accelerate the growth of the body of research that will be essential to deepening our collective understanding of what works with respect to crime control and related outcomes are two of just 5 important recommendations laid out in a recent Manhattan Institute report authored by my colleague, Charles Fane Lehman. Rounding out his list of recommendations are the following: using money to rehabilitate failing prisons and jails with a carrot and stick approach, creating and propagating national standards for criminal case processing, which often takes far too long, and upgrading our national data infrastructure, especially by creating a national Sentinel Cities program. Now, these ideas have enormous potential to do good by improving the quality of the services that our nation's criminal justice systems were established to provide, thereby enhancing the most precious public commodity that we have, public safety. And with respect to implementation, recent federal initiatives can offer some meaningful insight into how such efforts might be structured. And examples include Operation Stone Garden, which directed federal funds towards state and local law enforcement agencies participating in a joint effort with the Department of Homeland Security to help secure our borders. The Community-Oriented Policing Services Program, which helped fund state and local law enforcement agency hiring, among other initiatives. I'll close by noting that I'm encouraged by these committees' interest in assessing and assisting state and local law enforcement agencies facing one of the more challenging outlooks in a generation. As Thomas Paine noted in his famous pamphlet, Common Sense, security is the true design and end of government. The provision of public safety is therefore the most important of governmental functions that this body can help serve. And I hope that you will consider the recommendations that I have made with respect to how Congress might go about that important mission. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mangual. Members will now be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have had the opportunity to be recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I'd like to thank all of you for your service and for being here, for telling us your own community's needs, experiences, and how we can better come together. I want to push back on something that we just heard from some of our opening statements. We had 26,031 homicides in 2021, and this is on the CDC's website. And the rate of hate crimes in those homicides was 0.0008%. So Commissioner Cox, congratulations on bringing the crime rate down. I think what you've done is remarkable in Boston. And I've got the data here. This year, looking at 588 aggravated assaults, and you compare that to New York City, 8,901 in New York City, 8,901 in a soft on crime locality where aggravated assaults are there. So would you say that most of the 588 aggravated assaults are white supremacy related?
And I would say that there's no correlation. Well, you know what? I don't know without the data on that, but
I mean, is that consistent with the homicide rate, the aggravated assault rate, that it's extremely low?
there's no correlation I know of right now between white supremacists and
this notion that we hear. Let's focus on violent crime and the violent crime offenders. Let's focus on making sure that we actually take care of business. So I needed to push back on that because what we've just heard is the numbers aren't matching up. Chief Gerke, I want to talk about fentanyl a little bit. You've identified that fentanyl is one of the greatest harms in Odessa, Texas, and the surrounding area. And since 2019, fentanyl-related deaths among Texans have increased 500%. What is the greatest challenge you face in preventing fentanyl deaths and trafficking of fentanyl?
I mean, really, that's easy. It's keeping them from my community. Once they get into the community, it's very difficult to root them out. Again, it's heartbreaking to see that a lot of the fentanyl overdoses and deaths are concentrated on young people.
How difficult is it, the open border policies that we have, how difficult is that on Odessa, Texas?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it seems like there's just a sieve. Those narcotics, and we're not just talking about fentanyl, we're talking about all narcotics. Particularly in Odessa, I think our most predominant narcotic is probably methamphetamine use.
Can you talk to us about human trafficking and the effect that has had on your community?
Well, absolutely. You get calls about safe houses constantly. You respond to those things. You see constantly get calls. I know just over sometime last week we worked a prostitution sting and actually recovered 2 Chinese nationals who were trafficked. So yeah, it's an ongoing problem. I would think in Odessa, but I would also think all over the state of Texas and probably all over the southern border.
Well, thank you for your service to Odessa, Texas, for the shining example of what you've done over the last 26 years and now leading that department. Sheriff Barnes, thank you for your testimony. I took a couple of notes, and you talked about how California is an example and a warning of how not to be. And what I'd like to focus on is you describe how the consequences for crime have eroded over the last decade while law enforcement authorities are struggling to keep communities safe. Could you kind of tell the community or the committee here specific examples of when policy changes have tied your department's hands and not allowed you to have those consequences?
Sure, and I'll try to go fast. So over the course of the last decade, starting in 2011, was Assembly Bill 109. It was state prison realignment. Anybody sentenced to prison for nonviolent, non-serious, non-sex acts were now being housed for their time in county jails not designed for long-term incarceration. That resulted in a large impact on my facility because our staff is not designed to house people for years, and they're very non-compliant. 2014, we had a bill passed, Prop 46, that resulted in the largest decriminalization of crime in the state, drug crime and property crime. And those people are now not serving sentences as they would before. Then we had Prop 57. It's Prop 47 and Prop 57, mass decarceration of the federal prison, state prison system. That with SB 54, prohibiting us with acting with ICE on immigration holds except for very high-level offenders, and oftentimes them not getting picked up by ICE because they don't have the resources to do that. All of these have manifested into a large decarceration effort. I'll add that the last 5 peace officers killed in California were killed by violent felons who should have been in custody and were early released or pending sentencing on crimes that had access to guns that they should not have had. It's not the guns, it's the people getting possession of guns, the criminals getting possession of guns that create the greatest threat to our country.
Sheriff, thank you. We support you. We love everything that all of you do to keep our communities safe. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. And I thank all of our witnesses as well. This is a serious topic, and I think we owe it to our constituents back home to focus on solutions and not partisan mudslinging. And with solutions in mind, I want to focus on the experience in Boston because the data is clear. Crime of all categories down more than 50% since 2005. Violent crime down by a similar number. As was stated during Commissioner Cox's opening statement, shootings last year, the lowest they've been since the 1950s. So I want to learn from you, Commissioner Cox, because you've been in Boston for 30 years as a sworn officer. What has worked? What would you attribute those successes to, and what can other parts of the country learn from your example?
Well, thank you. Well, as I started off by saying, Boston Police is operated within a community policing model for a long period of time. And we not only do we practice that around building trust with our community, but we partner with everyone, including the federal government, including Homeland Security, and we've gotten a lot of grant funds and things of that nature to actually give us the data and technology to maybe to build it further from maybe 20 years ago around data and technology. And so partnership and actually acknowledging that we can't solve it alone, and from a law enforcement perspective, and there needs to be certainly a component where partnership with the community and the public, and actually a place and role for our partners to do things that we can't, to address the issues that might be driving the violence around us. Whether it's helping people find jobs, helping them with substance abuse, things of that nature, helping those families that are have traditionally been maybe involved in some of this, helping them get out of that cycle of poverty and things of that nature. So, I mean, we've done a lot over a long period of time, but we're constantly working to make sure we continue to do that, and by also making sure that we're not alone. Right? I think we've understood the fact is that law enforcement is not the total cure for this. We need others to partner. Everyone from the judicial to probation to the schools. Everyone in our community needs to partner around taking public safety seriously. And we are just more or less the educator of, if you're going to do it, this is how we're going to do it together.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think this emphasis on community policing, which you're right, Boston has been doing for decades, is a lesson well learned. It also so happens that Massachusetts has some of the toughest gun safety laws in the country. And so can you speak to the relationship there? Do you feel that the gun safety laws that have been passed in Massachusetts to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous individuals have made your job easier and have protected the lives of the men and women who you lead?
No, thank you for that. Yes, we do have some of the toughest laws in the country in that way. However, our experiences, and I think I put out some stats that for the most part, most of the guns are coming from elsewhere throughout the United States around that. And then obviously the ghost gun phenomenon that's occurring. And so, certainly the violent crime that we do have and the gun arrests and things that we have are usually driven by guns elsewhere around that. And so there doesn't seem to be any shortage of them. No matter how many arrests that we have, we're continuing to have more. And seeing younger and younger people with guns, which is a little disturbing.
And I would argue that that speaks to the need for a federal approach when it comes to gun safety legislation and not just a patchwork approach as we've had since the expiration of the assault weapons ban. We only have a minute left in my questioning. It's now the 10-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing, and as our subcommittee is charged with counterterrorism, can you speak to the lessons learned from that experience, and particularly the importance of federal and local information sharing through fusion centers?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so, first of all, we're very appreciative of all our federal partners in the sense that from a local perspective, in Boston at least, we can't, have all the knowledge it takes to, the work it takes and intel it takes to understand what's going on elsewhere throughout the country, never mind outside the United States. So the partnerships and the intel that we have from our, particularly Homeland Security and FBI, are very, very important. So we can actually help our community stay safe. Internally here, since there is a bit more of a trend around, domestic terrorism, if you want to use that term, just having information on who people are coming into our city before they get there, that is very valuable. So we can share it with our faith leaders and groups that might be impacted by those. This helps us build trust, so we keep those ties with the community we serve, so we can get people to see something and say something because we're providing some information about what's going on so they can feel safe. Part of our job is not only to deal with crime, but fear of crime. And the partnerships that we have, particularly with the federal government and the grants that you do, give us the ability to actually provide that education to keep the trust.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Chairman D'Esposito for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses, thank you again for being here, for your service. I'm going to start with Sheriff Barnes. I'm a firm believer in community policing. I'm a firm believer as well in the broken windows theory, where you focus on minor crimes and it will reduce major crime. It was a policy of New York City during Commissioner Kelly's tenure, and it's something that I think truly and dramatically changed the face of New York City. When I talk about violent crime and we talk about violent crime, I think we know the issues that are plaguing the communities. But I think what we need to focus on is that when we want to talk about community policing and we want to talk about the fact that that has helped in reducing crime in cities and counties and towns throughout this country, community policing is a buy-in. It's a buy-in between law enforcement, it's a buy-in between prosecutors, and it's a buy-in between stakeholders. And when one of those parts aren't bought in, the community policing falls apart. So I believe that small business is, or really all business, but it's definitely small business, is the lifeblood of our communities. And one of the things that you talked about in your testimony has nothing to do with violent crime, but I think it tells such a story. You said that there was $94.5 billion in retail theft throughout this country, the largest in California. I'm sure New York is probably right behind. When we talk about community policing and we talk about failed policies, the failure to prosecute, we've literally allowed minor crimes, right? People often roll their eyes and say, you're fear-mongering, this is petty theft. Well, I don't believe that anybody who owns one of those stores that were victims of that $94.5 billion thinks that this is petty. So I guess my question to you is, I think I know the answer, but it seems that we have some differing opinions up here. How do you think that this needs to change? How do we help solve this problem? Because $94.5 billion is a huge sum of money, and I guarantee you that there are business owners throughout this country who have literally shut their doors, main streets that are shuttered because of the crime that we've allowed to occur in communities throughout this nation.
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, in California, going back to Prop 47 that decriminalized property crime from felonies to misdemeanors resulted in exactly theft holidays. And I believe, I agree with you that the small family-owned stores suffered the most initially, and now what we're seeing are large businesses, the Walmarts, the Targets, the CVS's, they have the biggest voices. All these other mom pop shops, as you refer to them, they're single voice. But now that these larger corporations are being impacted, we're seeing the outcome of these bad policies in very urban areas. In San Francisco recently, we had Nordstrom's leave, CVS has left. Others have vacated that city, and I think we're starting to see a trend of, these are corporations, they're for profit. They don't make money, they will leave, and we're seeing that happen in major urban areas that have enacted bad public policy over the last several years.
Yep. You know, like going back home where Mr. Manguel and I live, I mean, there are CVS's and other stores, big stores, that have removed the shopping, the things that you carry around to put stuff in because they don't want people just filling them up and walking out the door with them. That's not the America that we wanted to create. Commissioner Cox, I just want to go to guns for a minute. You may not have this information. We were told that your state has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. Do you have, how many guns were recovered by the Boston Police Department in 2022?
I'm not sure, I can't say precise, but I would say, goodness gracious, around 700 or 800.
Okay, and out of those 700 or 800 firearms that were recovered, how many of them were assault weapons?
I couldn't give it to you with the, you know.
If you had to say, is it 10%? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? Is it 0%?
I would definitely not say it was 80%, but I would say, you know, there were a number of them.
Was it half?
I would have to look at this.
Okay, and the amount of shootings that you had in Boston, how many shootings did you have in Boston?
For 2022, non-fatal shootings.
No, shootings in general.
Yes.
Non-fatal and homicides.
So, let's say 2022, we had This chart only gives me year-to-date for a time period. It's not the whole year.
Okay, so just real quick, because my time's expired. Non-fatal shootings and homicides, how many do you think of those non-fatal shootings and homicides occurred with the use of a assault weapon?
Yeah, that I couldn't tell you because those are the ballistics.
Is it minimal? Is it half? Is it 80%? Or is it zero?
I would say it would be on the lower end of it, but
Okay, it's on the lower end of it.
I would say, but
Right.
again,
So illegal handguns are the majority of the violence that's occurring in our communities.
illegal handguns. But the fact is, there are there are different kinds, and so you have to match up ballistics evidence to that. And I don't want to do those.
I understand that, but my point is that illegal handguns are what's killing people in this country. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chairman now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter. 5 minutes questioning.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ranking Member Thompson mentioned in his opening statement about domestic violence and the domestic terrorism, rather, and the issue with racially motivated threats and white supremacy. Chairman Pfluger suggested or challenged that assertion. I want to turn your attention to this report that was done January 2020 by the Texas Department of Public Safety, which says domestic terrorism poses a persistent and varied threat to the state of Texas. It further goes on to say that based on the prevalence of recently conducted attacks nationwide, white racially motivated, or WRM, is currently the most violent active domestic terrorism type. And Mr. Chairman, I would like unanimous consent to add this to the record for the purposes of having everyone an opportunity to review these statistics, to know that just because we don't like it or because we don't want to talk about it doesn't make it go away. We see the rise of white supremacy and the violence that's acted out on the streets of America every day, and I'd like to
So ordered, Mr. Ranking Member.
thank you very much. I want to reiterate something I mentioned in my opening remarks. I'm grateful for law enforcement, the great work that you do, for the great officers. We know that they're good ones and we know that they're bad. And we want to make sure that we protect and provide resources so our good police officers are able to protect and serve all communities. But we know that there are things that make it difficult for you to work. We talk about, and particularly during this week of Police Week, we talk about things that we're asking you to do better, yet we aren't doing anything that would make your lives safer when you go out to apprehend a villain. We know that in many states we see the repeal of carry permits so people can get firearms without carry. We know that in many states the duty to inform has been removed from the process of those who are having concealed carries without permit. Can you talk about common sense gun safety reform and what it means and what it would mean to you and your colleagues, Commissioner Cox? We know that if we had more common sense gun measures, it will make a difference. Can you share with me your view?
So, I mean, I can only speak for Boston.
I only asked you about Boston.
In that way, and our gun laws are fairly strong, so you can't get a firearm if you certainly have a record of that sort, or certainly an open domestic violence case, or any type of conviction for the most part, or we have any other information that would indicate, I have the discretion that, you would potentially put people in harm's way around that stuff. So I, from our perspective, I think that the gun laws that I have, certainly in the city of Boston, and are fairly strong and addresses the issues. The issues we have is guns from other places that come in, and the fact that youth have these guns and the easy access of guns. That's the issue that certainly that we see and face about the flow of them and the easy access of them. For the most part, we're not having an issue, certainly locally, where people are applying for a license and doing things. So our region might be a little different, and it's hard for me to speak about another region on that one.
Let me shift gears for a second. The mass shooting at Covenant Schools in Nashville, Tennessee, took the lives of 6, including 3 children, on March 27th, brought this year's school shooting count to 89, with 75 total victims injured or killed. Next week will mark 1 year since the massacre at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, which left 19 children, two teachers dead. I'm outraged by the lack of will of my colleagues on the other side to do more to protect their children. Unfortunately, victims, their families, and law enforcement directly feel the impact of these shootings. Since Republicans refuse to support common sense laws to protect children and their families, law enforcement, can you talk about how local law enforcement has adjusted to the threats posed by military-style weapons being used to target our children in nation schools? Commissioner Cox.
So again, certainly making sure that people that struggle with mental health issues don't have access to guns or permits and things of that nature. We locally are partnering with schools in general to make sure schools are prepared around active shooter situations, there's faculty and things of that nature. But certainly looking out as a citizen, looking out in the big world, seeing these mass shootings in general, the increase of them, and then looking at the profile of some of the people from a reporting perspective, because I don't have firsthand knowledge of it, it does seem bewildering, like how some of these people got firearms in the first half of the time. And more importantly, it seems as though a lot of the people who do these things showed signs of potentially maybe doing these things, and yet no one reported it.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I'll perhaps come back on the next round. I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize my fellow New Yorker, Mr. Lalota, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank my good friends, Chairman Pfluger and Chairman D'Esposito, for putting this important hearing together during National Police Week, and especially to my fellow Long Islander, Chairman D'Esposito, who's a former NYPD detective and chief of the Island Park Fire Department. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your dedicated service to our community, but selfishly for bringing your experience to our committee today. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here. Chief, Sheriff, Commissioner, thank you especially for your service to your communities and to our country. You keep our children, our families, our communities safe every day, and this committee appreciates that. I have the privilege of representing New York's 1st Congressional District, or the East End of Long Island, Suffolk County. And the Suffolk County Police Department is home to 2,700 sworn police officers, 600 civilian members, and 400 school crossing guards. We also have the Riverhead, Southold, Shelter Island, East Hampton, and Southampton police departments in my district as well. And they, like you, serve every day to protect their communities, and we appreciate them as well. As this is National Police Week, I want to discuss the ways the federal government can be helpful to local law enforcement. As my colleague from Rhode Island said, we want to be solutions-oriented. So, Chief, Sheriff, and Commissioner, my first question is for you, gentlemen. In my home state of New York, we have unfortunately seen some of our elected leaders choosing to support criminals more than our law enforcement officers. In particular, cashless bail has been a disaster from the very beginning. My question is, what would morale look like for your departments, for your officers, for your deputies, if they knew a criminal they had just taken in would be released nearly hours later with no incentives to show back to court? Sheriff, you want to give it a shot first?
That's exactly the environment we are operating in California. I'm fortunate. My roster is almost full. I'm on the other end. I have a great retention in my organization, and we are attracting people. It's not because we're the highest paid. I think we have a highly supportive community, and that's probably the first most paramount thing, is having great community support. The media rhetoric is not accurate. The vast majority of Americans do support policing, so I'd start with that. I think one of the biggest issues, probably beyond what this board can do, is get us out of social work. That solves probably one of the biggest issues. If we didn't have to deal with the mental illness, the substance use that we proliferate. Right now, 1,000 people in my jail are on medication-assisted treatment. I have half of my people entrusted in my care have a daily nexus to mental health treatment. I run the largest detox facility in our county, the Orange County Jail. So those are probably the real issues that I think are the most challenging. Violent crime, of course, criminals have to be there. But when you look at resources and how taxed we are, getting us out of social work and let us do the job we got in to do in policing would probably be the biggest morale boost for our team.
Thanks, Sheriff. Commissioner, Chief, do you guys want to add something?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I think in my neck of the woods, which is West Texas, so we measure distance in time, not in miles. So I would have to second what the sheriff says in reference to mental health. If we encounter someone in crisis, we will absolutely, that officer that is assisting that person in crisis will be tied up their entire shift. So that includes a trip to a medical facility, but then they will have to transport that person in crisis to a mental health facility, which many times is 2.5 hours away. That does nothing for the officer, and it absolutely does nothing for that person in crisis. Could you imagine being in crisis and having to ride in a police car for 2.5 hours before you could get help? So that's an issue for us, and that's an issue that needs to be fixed, and we've been asking for it to be fixed for forever.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Certainly in my area, we have dangerous hearings, which we still do. So, if someone actually were to do a heinous crime, we don't have that trend right now of them being released, but we do have issues around juveniles. And the fact is that they might be involved in, certainly multiple gun arrests or things of that nature where they're not held at all. And not saying that it should be, but the around juvenile crime, that's a different issue that we're facing, and really, that has issues. As far as morale, concerning around the mental health challenges, I think that we all face in every jurisdiction. We'd love to be out of the business of dealing with folks that had mental illness, but the reality is I don't know how we can, because virtually every call we go to, in some way, shape, or form, it seems like it pops up. So if our officers aren't informed in some way, I'm really afraid of what the outcome might be. So we're always going to have the challenge of making sure that they're trained around some of these issues.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Mangual. Apologize. I had another question for you, but maybe we'll get you on a future round. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lilota. I now recognize Mr. Correa of California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we begin, I'd like to ask unanimous.
Without objection.
City of Santa Ana. My daughter was at home all alone. I was in El Paso, Texas. I got the phone call. I called Santa Ana PD. They were there quickly. Thank you very much to all men and women in uniform for what you do. Just want to say that back home, I like to think in my district, other parts, that we take care of our men and women in uniform. We give you collective bargaining, which justifies, make sure that you have a good salary, have good pensions, and we have workers' compensation presumptives, which means when you get hurt, we make sure that you're taken care of. A lot of those bills I authored when I was in Sacramento. Sheriff Barnes, if I can, I want to welcome you here today and want to talk to you a little bit about, sounds like the biggest issue we have back home, which is fentanyl. I agree with you. In my district, not a week goes by that I don't hear about a death, a young person overdosing on fentanyl. Supply side. 90% of the fentanyl that's intercepted is intercepted through our ports of entry. And San Ysidro probably accounts for 67% of all the fentanyl that is seized coming into this country. Operation Blue Lotus, I just talked to the port director on Sunday. I was there visiting their operation. From March to May, 6,900 kilos of narco, 900 kilos of meth, 1,400 of fentanyl, just in those few months. Yet, at the ports of entry, only 2% of the vehicles coming through the port, through our ports, are actually scanned. Can you imagine if we scanned 4%? 5%, 6% of those vehicles. And sadly, I voted against that border bill that was passed last week. Not a cent goes towards those ports of entry. Not a new cent goes to hiring new people there, hiring new technology, or I should say, bring in new technology, and more police dogs to scan, to help the scanners. And again, can you imagine if we inspected more than 2% of those vehicles, the success we would have? Sheriff, you said something in your testimony that caught my interest, which is we have a situation, we have the environment of California laws that prohibit you from reporting certain individuals, communicating with immigration officials upon the release of certain inmates. And yet you said there are many inmates that you do talk to immigration officials about, but they fail to actually come by and pick those individuals up. Can you describe what kind of individuals those people would be convicted of?
Sure, that's a result of a Senate bill in California, SB 54, and it only allows me to communicate with ICE officials on high-level offenders or repeat offenders of certain offenses.
Describe those high-level offenders.
These would be murderers, child molesters, drug dealers, violent crimes.
And if I may, I only have a minute left. Those are the people I don't want in my community. My district, we have a lot of undocumented workers that have been in the country 20, 30 years. Hard workers who also don't want these individuals in their neighborhood. So I would offer to work with you on this issue. I want to make sure if there are people who are supposed to be picked up after they rape in our communities, that they are taken care of appropriately. They don't come back to our communities. And to hear from you that a lot of those individuals are just, that ICE fails to pick them up is unacceptable to me. So you're my sheriff. We work together. We hang out together, have lunch. I look forward to working with you on this issue as we go forward.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Correa. I now recognize Mr. Strong from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to serve with each of you. I join my colleagues in recognizing our nation's law enforcement officers, and particularly the individuals in my district that wear the badge and those that have given all in the line of duty. To mention a few, Billy Clardy was killed on December the 6th, 2019 by a drug dealer that should have been in jail. Garrett Crumbly, March 28th, 2023, just 50 days ago, was killed on a domestic violence call. Mr. Gerke, Mr. Barnes, and Mr. Cox, I'd like to thank you for your service and joining us here today, and also those in law enforcement that are seated behind you. This hearing is particularly timely as we commemorate National Police Week and the officers that have given their lives. In the last 2 years, our country has become less safe, both for the average American and for our law enforcement officers. This year's FBI data regarding line of duty deaths paint the picture. The number of ambush attacks on law enforcement officers in 2022 reflects a 50% increase from the previous year. We may disagree on how we got here, but we should all agree that we need to do more to support law enforcement and to ensure that they can safely carry out their mission. With that, I'd like to start with a question for our law enforcement officers today. Chief Gerke, how has the current climate impacted your ability to do your job?
You know, things just get busier and busier, and the current climate is, I think that is one of the reasons that we see the numbers of sworn individuals in a lot of municipalities have gone down. Everyone has open positions because of they see the danger involved in policing. It's broadcast constantly. Those negative things, those bad things, and law enforcement has done. Law enforcement officials have done some very bad things in the recent past, but those things get attributed to every police officer, every sheriff's deputy in the United States, which is absolutely a false statement, right? I will absolutely say that no one wants to get rid of a a bad police officer, a bad deputy more than a good police officer or a good deputy. That is an absolute fact. So I think that those things absolutely impact us numbers wise, and when you don't have numbers, it affects your ability to do your job.
Thank you, Chief. In my previous service, I was the chairman of the third largest county in the state of Alabama and the largest city in Alabama, where in less than 10 years, our county almost doubled the size of its law enforcement, and where greater than 50% of the general fund is directed to the sheriff's department and in law enforcement, which led to about a 59% increase in less than 10 years for law enforcement. It worked. Your studies that we have seen, research indicates less policing leads to less crime. Sheriff, is that what you found?
I believe that it's the right policing leads to less crime. And so it's not a saturation, it's an engagement, it's partnering with the community, it's having great multifaceted programs, juvenile-based, school-based, response-based, faith community-based. It's all based on relationships. So what I found, and I believe the officers working for me love the aspect of community engagement. Many of them live in these communities. So it's the relationship and the support that helps that. And that's where this committee's influence comes in so vital, because it's those resources that allow us to build upon successful programs, emulate them, and share them across a larger spectrum of our agencies to do what we know works best. And we have many examples of those in Orange County.
So that shows that more policing is better for our communities. Mr. Mangwal, would you agree that you've said that defunding or diverting funds away from policing is not the best way to stop rising crime in the U.S. Is that correct?
And that's absolutely correct. I mean, again, the overwhelming conclusion that you can draw from the body of research on the effect of policing on crime is that the more policing and the quality matters that you have, the less crime that you're going to have. And so when you divert funds away from the sort of tip of the spear in your core law enforcement institutions, that is going to make streets less safe. I think the data bears that out in every analysis that actually tests that question.
Would you say that by adding more law enforcement in the field, would that reduce crime?
Say that one more time, sorry.
Would you believe that adding more law enforcement officers, would that increase or decrease crime?
It would absolutely decrease crime. It would absolutely decrease crime. Every study that's ever been done to assess the impact of either additional police spending, or expansions of police patrols have found significant reductions in crime of all sorts within those jurisdictions.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize fellow New Yorker, Mr. Goldman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here. I was a federal prosecutor working with task forces, NYPD, and an assortment of federal law enforcement agents for 10 years. And Chief Garrity, what you just said is exactly what every law enforcement officer I ever worked with said, which is we got to root out the bad apples, because the vast, vast majority are really good apples working really hard to defend our communities and promote public safety. It's interesting as I sit here, because what I'm hearing from the witnesses on the ground about what the needs are and what effective policing is very different from what I'm hearing from my colleagues up here. And Sheriff Barnes, I think you made an important distinction just now in the questioning you received from my colleague from Alabama when he said more policing would be better, and you said right policing is more effective. And I think that's incredibly important. More in terms of quantity does not necessarily make the difference. And I want to focus a little bit on what several of you have talked about in terms of community-based policing, and especially community-based violence intervention programs. Commissioner Cox, can I start with you? Can you just explain what you mean when you say you engage and utilize community-based violence intervention programs?
Sure, thank you. So, community policing really is about building trust, and how do you go about doing that? And you can do it multiple ways, from engaging youth in games and things of that nature, to mentoring kids in school, to actually working with residents to address whatever the issue of the day. The more you work with people and they get to understand, our officers and see that they're people too, the more trust they have, the more we were able to, provide, education tips on how to stay safe. The more they're able to tell us about where we should be, right? Data is one thing, but having on the ground information and intel from the people that live there around the problems that go on, that is how we can put officers in the right place to help prevent these things from happening in the first place. And so understanding what the issues are in these communities through dialogue, through actually building relationships, we're able to also bring in partners to address their other issues and problems that might be the root of some of the reasons why people choose to go down the life of crime.
So is it fair to say that if your officers had more time to spend in the communities, that they would be able to prevent more crime from happening before it happens?
I believe so. Working in conjunction with the residents there, yes, absolutely.
And one of the things that several of you have touched upon is, and Chief Gerke, you just mentioned this, and I think this is important, is the prevalence of mental health issues in the calls, the 911 calls, and other requests that are made to all of your offices. I guess I have a basic question, which is, would it be helpful to you if you had support from mental health professionals who could help to either diffuse a situation or handle a mental health issue once it had been diffused? Is that something that support would be helpful to your staff?
I think that support would be helpful to any law enforcement agency. Absolutely, that is because mental health issues are so prevalent in our communities.
And your officers, am I right, are not trained mental health professionals?
They have some training in helping those folks in crisis that we encounter, but no, they are not trained, qualified mental health professionals.
One of the things that the chairman has talked about here today several times is the notion of illegal firearms. And one of the issues, I think, Chief Gerke, that you may be able to touch on is there was a significant and deadly mass shooting in your county in 2019. And it was an individual who couldn't pass a background check, had been adjudicated by a judge to be mentally incompetent. So he wasn't able to buy a gun legally, and he went and bought a gun illegally and then used it for a mass shooting. If there were universal background checks that would apply to private sales as well, that would have caught that shooter, wouldn't have?
Gentlemen's time's expired. The witness, you can answer the question.
So absolutely, that mass shooting was perpetrated by an individual that could not pass a background check because of his mental health status, and he did go and purchase a firearm from a individual that was making these on a personal basis. Although I believe he was making about $60 a year on a personal basis, so he was absolutely he was a manufacturer. So if he was required to do a background check, I think that yes, that would have been caught.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a New York Times article titled, quote, "How Gun Traffickers Get Around State Gun Laws," which shows that in New York and New Jersey, more than 2/3 of guns used in crimes come from out of state, mostly from states in the South with much more lax gun laws, and that 6,000 guns used in crimes in California came from other states with lax gun laws such as Texas.
Without objection, the gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize Mr. Crane of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you guys for coming here today. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to have so many police up in the Capitol this week. Thank you for what you do, and please let your families know that we appreciate what they do as well. I want to go ahead and read the Second Amendment real quick because I think that it's something that probably doesn't get read or mentioned enough up here. And I think often some of the politicians that have taken an oath to, protect the Constitution of the United States often forget what it says. A well-regulated militia be necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Chief, what do you think of the Second Amendment? Do you think that we should hold to it? Do you think we should honor it? Yes or no?
Absolutely honor it.
Sheriff Barnes, what do you think?
I can guarantee you that I absolutely do honor it.
Commissioner Cox, what do you think, sir?
We honor it. Yeah.
I'm sorry, let me get the name. Mr. Mangual, what do you think, sir?
I absolutely think it should be honored.
Well, I appreciate that you guys said that because I know that there are plenty of people in this country that would love to see it go away. And many of them don't want to take it in one fell swoop. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Do you guys know that Mexico has some of the most violent gun crimes in the world? You guys know what their gun laws are? You guys know, can people just own guns in Mexico like we can here? Sheriff Barnes?
Their gun laws are very prohibitive.
Yeah, they are. That's weird, isn't it, Sheriff? Why is that? That doesn't add up. I don't understand. If their gun laws are so strict, how is it often ranked in the top 5 globally for gun violence? Maybe you can help me with that one.
Because they don't enforce their gun laws.
Yeah. And is it true, Sheriff, Chief, Commissioner, that criminals often don't care about laws?
I can tell you that what we've seen in some of the lawlessness, that those who are committing violent crimes with guns are those who are prohibited from possessing them because of their criminal acts. That's been my experience.
Yeah. Thank you. Sheriff, I was listening to your opening testimony, and one of the phrases that you chose struck me. You said, policy created lawlessness. Can you expound on that, Sheriff?
Certainly. So I think that we have had over the course of in California and probably other parts of this nation, policies that are passed for political extremist positions rather than focused on keeping our public and our constituents safe. We've seen that manifest over the last 10 years plus in California. We've seen attacks on some of the Second Amendment, for example. There's a bill in California to make it so prohibitive, but on its face is believed to be absolutely unconstitutional. So why would pass something like that is beyond my...
Yeah, thank you. Chief, what did defund the police, what did you think of that whole movement? What'd that do to your department?
Well, the area that I police in, that wasn't even an option. That was never something that was brought up or even considered. So,
was it good? Was it good for you guys, Chief, or bad?
Oh, it's bad because you look around and you say those poor guys wherever defunding was happening, and you would say those poor guys in that department. You'd hear our rank and file say, "I'd hate to work for that department. I hate to work for that city," because they don't appreciate us like they do in West Texas.
Commissioner Cox, what about you, sir? Defund the police. Was that good or bad for your department, for your city?
Defund the police, philosophy as well as several other things has probably made it a lot more challenging to certainly retain officers and more or less attract young people to our profession.
I thought so. The last thing I want to do is I want to read bits of an article that a friend of mine wrote about some of the gun data being thrown around. Activists seeking restrictions on the Second Amendment are fond of citing, quote, homicide rates, unquote. Instead of raw homicide numbers, they do this because it allows them to skirt any admission of gun control failures in blue states. California's pro-gun control governor, Gavin Newsom, provides a good example of the left's propensity to use rates to avoid the use of raw numbers. On May 13, 2023, he tweeted, "It has to be the humidity. Why else would California's gun violence rate be 57% lower than Florida's?" That tweet, coupled with Newsom's ongoing push for more gun control alongside criticism of Florida laws like constitutional carry, concealed carry, etc., appears designed to give readers the impression that California's gun control keeps people safe while Florida's Pro 2A costs more lives. But here's the raw statistics. Number of homicides in California during 2021 was 2,495, according to the CDC homicide mortality map. The CDC's homicide mortality map shows the number of homicides in Florida in 2021 was 1,468. So there's a lot of misdirection, more misinformation about gun data and violence in the United States, and it's the same old thing,
Gentleman's
just
time
shift.
expired.
Shift fire. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crane. And before we get to our next, I just have to comment, Chief Gerke, to Mr. Crane's questioning, and I think it's one of the reasons why we're having this hearing today, and one of the biggest detriments that we see to law enforcement. When you discussed the defund the police movement, you said that you heard over and over again, not just from your department, from throughout other people in law enforcement, quote, I would hate to work for that department. And I think that sums up why we're here today. We need to make sure that our law enforcement professionals throughout this country never think that and never say that. With that, I now recognize Ms. Titus of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. We've heard a lot about community policing. I would argue, and I think statistics show this, that part of that is having police officers look like the people they serve. Having more diverse police departments, because that way they can build trust in a community, they can serve as role models for a community, they can get more information from the community, there's better communication. A Spanish-speaking officer, for example, in an area that's largely Hispanic would be able to build that trust. So I would just add that to the notion of community policing. You've all also talked about the need for better cooperation or collaboration between the federal government and the local governments. You've mentioned grants, so it's about money, but also information. So I'd like to ask you about the information that you are trying to get from the ATF about gun tracing. We have tried to set up a national searchable centralized gun transaction database, but largely due to the efforts of the gun lobby, that's not happened. So the ATF's hands are really tied, and it takes, the statistics shows, an ATF employee would have to sift through about 1,800 documents per day, absent a digital system, to determine the history of a crime gun. We hear a lot about these illegal guns. Commissioner, could you talk about the need for better information to be able to better trace these guns?
I mean, we can always want more and better, so there's no doubt about that. But we work well with the ATF locally. As a matter of fact, we have them embedded in our office, and we have officers embedded with them as well. So, I mean, there's always a backlog of guns and tracing and things of that nature. But I can't sit here today and criticize the ATF in any way because their partnership has been fairly strong in Boston. But it's a matter of resources, and so more would be better.
Are they part of your fusion center? I know most large cities and states have fusion centers.
They are not. We have our Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and they are not a part of that. But the fact is, we have a ballistics unit, and they actually have personnel assigned to our unit and task force. We have multiple task force part of the JTTF. And we actually have one with ATF that we have an actual body, actually two bodies assigned with them.
Well, I'm glad to hear that's the case in Boston, because it doesn't seem to be the case in a lot of cities where we hear that ATF takes too long to provide information. Let me ask you another question about this cooperation between state and or federal and local governments, and that's with red flag laws. We haven't gotten much passed through the Congress about gun violence regulation, but the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act did set aside $750 million in funding for states to pursue, implement, improve what they called extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws. I think 19 states have done that, including Nevada has a red flag law. Could you tell us, Chief, or anybody, how these laws help you or hurt your efforts in stopping violence with guns?
I can tell you that I'm a believer in red flag laws, and we have several provisions in California to take guns away from people who are prohibited from possessing firearms. My agency not only has issued the most CCWs in California, but also has investigative teams that go out and take guns away from people who are prohibited from possessing them. To your previous question real quick, one of the big issues on querying for databases on guns is the fact that you have to go to, I think it's many as 20 different databases to search for ownership, guns, other things. If they could narrow that query down to one query that searches all those databases, it would make not only ATF, but agencies working with ATF much more successful and utilize resources much more efficiently if that were to be employed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So anybody else have an opinion on red flag laws?
I'll say in Texas that, particularly victims of family violence, those are of great concern to us. Those are issued emergency protective orders almost immediately. And when that happens, those people are prohibited from carrying guns right at that point. And my department, we take a very proactive approach to those. When we know that there's been a protective order issued, we will go by that residence, sometimes twice a shift to check on those protected individuals to make sure they're okay. Also, going back to the ATF question, we do follow up. Anytime there is a gun crime, we want to know where that gun came from. Many times that gun is stolen. Mm-hmm. So that answers one question. But if that gun is not stolen and it's in the hand of a 16-year-old gang member, how did that 16-year-old gang member come to own that gun or possess that gun? So we do trace that back. We find those owners and we find out, particularly you want to know if that one owner has bought 17, 20, 30 guns in the last 5 months, right? Those are things that are important to know.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Burkeen of Oklahoma for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairman. Thank you all for being here. You're heroes to people that you protect, and grateful to you. As my colleague said a while ago, also the thanks to not only your families, but all the families who, when they say goodbye in the morning, they know the danger that their loved ones encounter throughout the day. And so what an amazing testament of courage to our men and women in the policing service. I want to recognize in Oklahoma last year we had 3 officers lost in the line of duty. I just want to just pay honor to them and their families. Deputy Sheriff Jeremy McCain of Oklahoma County, Patrolman Joseph Barlow of McAllister, and Detention Officer Kenneth Fowler of Pontotoc County. I found it astounding this morning. Mr. Gerke, Mr. Barnes, you both alluded to fentanyl being one of your priority issues, and which absolutely, as we know, is a result of lack of enforcement, lack of capture at our southern border, given the flow. And so in 2021, we know that 70,000 deaths occurred. It's the leading cause of death, fentanyl poisoning. Many times people thinking they're taking some other substance or taking fentanyl, and it leads to their demise. And that 70,000 would be as if a jetliner every day was crashing to get to that annual number. That's the leading cause of death, 18 to 45 in America today. In Oklahoma, in 2022, there were 326 Oklahomans who died from fentanyl. And just in the first 5 months of this year, there's already 300. So it's just a number that continues to grow. The deadly mixture of tranq that keeps Narcan from being able to revive someone. My question to anyone at the panel, what are you seeing with this? What's your experience, and what are your suggestions as it pertains to what the federal government can be doing with this dangerous mixture concoction of the fentanyl being laced with xylazine?
So I'm also the county coroner in Orange County, and we look at all that data. We've seen the presence of xylazine increase over the last 4 years to become much more dominant. So we know that that is a causal factor in the synergy created in with fentanyl. So it is an ongoing issue. The rise of the 70,000, in our analysis of the fentanyl addiction, the vast majority of those deaths are people not taking one pill, or people who are addicted to fentanyl, who are seeking out fentanyl as an addiction that is causing their demise. It's just, in my analysis, was 96% of those who died in my area as a result of fentanyl had an addiction or prior arrests for drug offenses that weren't first-time users. That does happen. The clandestine produced pills are obviously being sold as Xanax, OxyContin, oxycodone, and other things. They do have xylazine, sometimes mixed, but it's mostly the addicts. And they're seeking out the pure fentanyl for an addictive high.
Sheriff Barnes, since I've got you on the mic already, I want to kind of pivot to something I found really interesting. You talked about the lawlessness that policies as a laboratory of experimentation that your state has been seeing. And you quoted some numbers that your prison population as of 2010 was 165,000, and that dropped to 90,000, almost in half. In a 10-year time period to date, you're about 90,000 prison population. But what you talked about in your opening remarks was that decriminalization element where state law has been changed. It's led to a 31% increase of homicides in that same time period. A 31% increase in homicides, and the population only rose 10%. It's astounding. Also in that 30 percentile range was aggravated assaults had grown 30%. You then talked about that those that are killed, officers that are killed in the line of duty, come from those with extensive criminal records. And you, a moment ago, told a member of this panel that it's not the gun, it's those that are getting the gun. And so we see in America today, the gun is looked at as the target for our focus. And yet I appreciate you talking about the human factor. Would you expound upon that?
Sure. So just to put that in perspective, I've issued 20,000 CCWs, and none of those individuals have gone out and committed a homicide. So I think when you look at just guns being issued, it's the criminal element using guns in the commission of crimes, oftentimes when they should have been incarcerated for the previous crimes, that is driving the violence that we're seeing with this decarceration efforts.
So just to follow in the ending with this, Mr. Chairman, that if we would be more apt to go after the criminals and not bring about policy that decriminalizes them on lesser crimes, we could go to the heart of what leads to more aggressive, more violent behavior years later. It's ushered in by being lax on criminal behavior. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman's time's expired. Before we get to the next speaker, I just want to, going back to my questioning before, Mr. Cox. So in 2022, there were 563 people charged with unlawful possession in Boston. That was 93% of all firearm arrests. The overwhelming majority of shootings, both with victims and not with victims, involved handguns. And according to the complaints that were filed, there was not one that referred to any white supremacy-driven violent crime. With that, I now recognize Mr. Ivey of Maryland for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield to Mr. Correa to follow up on a point that was made earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Ivey. I just want to ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record an article from the Trace titled "Gun Recovered in Mexico Come Mostly from U.S. Makers." Shows that as much as 90% of all guns recovered in Mexican soil originate from the U.S. If I can admit this for the
Without
record,
objection,
please.
Mr. Correa.
Thank you. And very quickly, if I can respond to my colleague who's not here right now, I wish she'd be here, about guns in Mexico. I don't make Mexican laws. I'm a U.S. lawmaker, but we did meet, Democrats and Republicans met with the Mexican president about 2 or 3 months ago. And this was one of the issues that was brought up by the Mexican president, which is he needs help from us addressing the gun smuggling issue. He was telling the story of the arrest of Chapo Guzman's son. 14 soldiers, Mexican soldiers, died in that action. And he said they had 50 caliber weapons. We can't compete with those. And so they need our help. So yeah, Second Amendment, preserve it, but let's make sure, like my sheriff says, that we go after the criminal element as well. I yield.
Thank you. And to the chairman's point, I appreciate the fact that assault weapons are not the vast majority of, are used in the vast majority of murders in the United States. I don't think that means that we don't try and control both, because it's clear that assault weapons, we'll have a hearing at 2 o'clock, we'll talk a lot about that today, are driving the mass killings in the country by far. This is Police Week. I want to take a moment and acknowledge police officers, especially in my jurisdiction of Prince George's County. I was the state prosecutor there for 8 years and worked with them closely. Prosecuted officers who crossed the line, but the vast majority of our more than 2,000 officers did a hard job well. I did want to say quickly with respect to the commissioner, when I ran for office in 2002, the basis for my campaign was to implement the Boston strategy in Prince George's County. And the logic of that for me was, yes, we need tough enforcement, but we want to have a carrot and stick approach. So we want to make sure that we do everything we can for intervention and prevention efforts. Chief, as you mentioned a minute ago, it's better to preempt the crime than to deal with arrests after the fact, because then you're saving victims from having to undergo the suffering, the death and the loss and the like. Sheriff, you mentioned the thefts that take place. Trying to preempt that is a good way to go as well. But I do want to preempt or push back a little bit on the approach or the suggestion that incarceration is the only way to deal with this problem. You know, I remember when we had 2.2 million people in jail here in the United States. I think there was a point where we surged ahead of China and had more people incarcerated than any other country in the world. Certainly, there's a place for enforcement, but I found that we had success with intervention and prevention efforts that incorporated the faith community, outreach to our schools. We used coaches. Whatever strategy we could approach to try and reach young people in particular before they got into trouble, or if they were in trouble to pull them back out of trouble, if they were in gangs, for example, we thought that was an important way to go. And I think that dovetailed well with the community policing strategy that was outlined a minute ago by the commissioner, and also with respect to outreach to the citizens. It's a team effort, and the most successful strategies, I think, are the ones that try and integrate law enforcement along with prosecutors, but also making sure that the community is bought in and is part of what's going on with respect to reducing the crimes, because they are the witnesses in these cases when they come to court. They are the ones that provide the tips to the police to make the arrest, and sometimes they're the ones that provide the tips to go get the gun before somebody gets shot with it. Or gets brought out of the car, or out of the police, or out of the school locker. I did want to say this too, just quickly with respect to your testimony. I appreciated the fact that you outlined your partnerships, actually both of you did, with federal prosecutors and federal law enforcement. We've got bills here in the House where one of my colleagues a Republican colleague offered a bill to eliminate ATF. One has offered to a bill to eliminate the FBI. There have been calls by certain national leaders to eliminate the Department of Justice and the FBI. But I know from my experience, and just based on what I read from your testimony, that the federal and state and local partnership can be very effective. In fact, sometimes the most effective in fighting crime. So I commend you for the work that you do, and I encourage you to keep it up. And I thank you for coming here today.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for your valuable testimony, and obviously to my colleagues for their questions. Perhaps we don't often agree on everything, but I think during this week, especially whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, we can recognize and agree that we appreciate all of your hard work, your sacrifice, the work that you do to keep our community safe. So thank you to all for being here, for making the trip here, and I think for really engaging in a conversation to move policing forward and keep police officers safe across this nation for the future. The members of the subcommittees may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we could ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.